the last time we were in Matthew, we looked at this crazy story about a farmer who hires a group of people at sunrise, and then he goes back, he hires them around 6 a.m., and then he goes back at 9 a.m. and hires some more, and then some more at noon, and some more at 3, and then actually he goes back about 5 o'clock and hires a few more, and at the end of the day, he pays them all the same. And let's be honest, for most of us growing up, especially in the United States, where we have learned somewhat rightly that if you work more, you get paid more. But Jesus says that's not the way it works in the kingdom. And honestly, that's a little confusing, isn't it? It's as if there's a different math, a different economy in the kingdom of God. And we learned about the fact that the way things work in God's kingdom will not always make sense to us. And that God is God and we should not ask for what we deserve, right? I mean, a lot of us, I actually... after I preached that, I heard another story. Sometimes people share with me. I heard a preacher say this, and somebody said that there was a survey that showed that most Christians consider themselves 9 a.m. workers. Because, we don't want to be so prideful that we're like, I've been here all the day. I'm one of those really prime people. Most Christians see themselves as 9 o'clock workers, but not noon, not 3, and definitely not 5. But the point of the story is that God chooses to bless who he will bless. And then at the end of that story, Jesus went and told them for the third time, okay? Now, we understand, I think, that there were things that happened and conversations that happened and stories that Jesus told that aren't recorded in the Gospels, okay? Obviously, they were together for 3 years. There's more than what we see here. But in the Gospel of Matthew, 3 times, Jesus looks his disciples in the eye and says, now, I'm going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be crucified. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be turned over to the authorities. I'm going to be hung on a cross, and I'm going to die. And then I'm going to rise again. If they recorded 3 of these in the Gospel of Matthew, you wonder how many more times. You almost picture that Jesus almost at least once a week was like, okay, guys, in case you don't get this, I'm gonna die. But Luke, in this same story, in this same passage, says they did not understand what he was saying. And it's easy for us to look back and say, how dense were they? Really? Don't you think that at some point in the future, people will look back at us and say, how dense were they? But Jesus tells that story in verses 17 through 19. He says, this is what's going to happen. Now, we have to understand this as first century Jews would have. Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, and he says in verse 18, we're going up to Jerusalem. Now, that would have sounded very normal to the Jewish people of that day. Number one, Jerusalem is kind of set on a hill, so you would go up to Jerusalem wherever you were. But also, that was seen, Jerusalem was understood by the people of God to be kind of the upward journey. They were going to go up to Jerusalem, and that was the vision. That was, in fact, even to this day, faithful Jews will say, when they celebrate Passover, they will say, next year in Jerusalem. Because that was the goal. But his disciples would have heard this way. He says, we're going to Jerusalem now. And they knew that he was the Messiah. Peter had said just a chapter or two before, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so he was saying, Jesus, you're the Messiah. And they knew that the Messiah would establish his kingdom in Jerusalem. That's where it would happen. Now, maybe some of them believed that it was the military, that he was going to go and overthrow the Romans. Now, the previous chapter, Jesus had said to his disciples, I'm going to reign and you are going to sit on thrones with me, which that's a pretty good gig if you can get it, right? I'm going to sit on the throne next to the Messiah. And it says he took them aside in verse 17. And that would have been necessary because we already know that there are huge crowds. I think there's a tendency to picture Jesus and his disciples and maybe a few other people. But it says a couple chapters earlier that there were large crowds following him. And so Jesus is walking along and his disciples are around him, and there are maybe hundreds, thousands of other people with him. And what would have happened was there would have been literally tens of thousands of other Jews headed to Jerusalem. Okay? So this is a crowd. And Jesus pulls the disciples off to the side. And he says, we're going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he will be raised to life. Now, he says that, but it becomes obvious quickly that they only heard the first 6 words. We're going up to Jerusalem. They apparently, and we've all been there, right? Somebody says something to us, and all we hear is the kind of, it's the you had me at hello kind of thing, you know, where we only hear the part that really grabs us. And in order to understand this, I want to use kind of an illustration. Picture with me, a game of kind of whole life chutes and ladders. If you remember that game from your childhood. And the idea in this game is that we have ladders that are going up, and we don't know which ladder to climb, but we know in our life that we're supposed to choose a ladder. But, you know, there's a wall up here, and we can't really see where the ladders go, where they lead. And in fact, there's maybe an option for a ladder that goes down. And so we're supposed to choose a ladder. But there's a problem, and we're going to look at 4 problems with ladders. And the first problem is this: we don't know where the ladder leads. Sometimes we don't understand where a ladder goes. Look at verse 20. The mother of James and John came to Jesus with her sons. This isn't just a typical helicopter mom, busting in and saying, my kid is special. You should take care. That's not what we're talking about here. In fact, her sons are with her. And maybe they're like, oh, come on, Mom, don't, no, Mom, don't. But we don't sense that. And kind of is the stereotype of a good mom, especially a good Jewish mom, you say, my boys are special. And as a parent, that's not bad, isn't it? I mean, we should think that our kids are extraordinary. I mean, our kids are, but the rest of you should also think that your kids are. The first problem with ladders, though, is it's hard to see where the ladder leads. And this woman, the mother of James and John, comes to Jesus and says, can you have my boys sit on your right and left? Because she knows that Jesus just said there's going to be these thrones. But she doesn't just want her boys to be in the line of thrones. She wants the prime real estate for her boys, right? Because she's looking around and she's going, that's Peter guy and Andrew and Matthew and all these guys. They're okay, but my boys, they're special. And so she says, can they sit on your right and your left? See, she didn't understand where the ladder led. She wants her boys to climb the ladder. They want to climb the ladder. But she doesn't understand where that ladder leads. So then it goes on. She asks, and she actually kneels down to acknowledge his authority. But if you look at the question, I wonder if sometimes it's possible to be kneeling on the outside and standing up proudly on the inside. She is saying, kneel, I acknowledge that he's the Messiah, but she has her agenda that she wants to kind of nudge him towards. What is it you want? He asked. And she says, well, I want them to sit on your right and your left. Now, we know that the disciples have already been arguing about who's the greatest in the kingdom. It's almost like the disciples, and let's face it, we're like this, they've been playing a big game of King of the Hill. You remember playing King of the Hill when you were a kid? Especially boys. If there's any hill or mountain or just a mound of dirt, I remember when they were building an addition on the school a block away from us. When I was growing up, I was in about second grade, and there was a big pile of dirt because they dug a basement. And we had every boy in the neighborhood, and the King of the Hill game is where one person gets up on top of the hill, on top of the mound, and if anybody else comes up, they push him down. Again, a very boy game, right? And we're pushing, and the point is, I want to win, which means you, to some extent, lose. And James and John and their mom are saying, we should be, well, not king of the hill. Jesus, you're the king, but we wouldn't mind being the princes of the hill. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Now, this is a little confusing because in that time, the idea of a cup was often used to symbolize suffering and pain. In fact, when Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, what did he pray? Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. So it's clear to them that Jesus is not saying, yeah, can you also be glorified with me? But we're not really sure, based on the whole behavior of the disciples, that they really understand what they're saying. I mean, let's be honest. If somebody says, hey, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be arrested, do you want to drink that cup with me? We might say, I'm courageous, I'll be arrested with you, and mocked. Okay, yeah, I'll drink that cup, and flogged, whipped to the edge of death. I think some of us would say, oh, that sounds like a good cup for you, Jesus. Or maybe Andrew or Peter. And crucified. But they courageously or naively say, we can. Jesus says to them, you will indeed drink from my cup. And history tells us that actually they do end up giving their lives. Now, John actually lived out his natural life, but he was exiled, arrested and exiled in the Isle of Patmos. But all the rest of the disciples end up being martyred. They drink from the cup. Now it goes on, and in verse 24, it says, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant. Now, it's easy to look at James and John and their mom and say, come on, what are you doing trying to get all the best spot, the best thrones for you? But the others were indignant, which means they also kind of wanted the right and left part. See, the second problem with ladders and climbing the ladder is that it often requires us to pull others down. If you watch the Olympics, there were in the long distance races, there is often at the beginning and at the end, again, you see really subtle nudging and elbows, and it in fact, it's not always even subtle. People are cutting each other off, and even though these, the distance runners are about, 6'2", 97 pounds, so I can't imagine that the elbows hurt very much, although they're sharp when you're 6'2", 97 pounds. But it's aggressive. It's, I want to cut you off. I will do what I need to do I will pull you down so that I can climb up. Again, go back to the image of the ladders. If there are ladders going up, and if we're climbing to the top of the ladder and there are a lot of people, there's going to be some yanking and pulling and kicking down, and the people. But Jesus doesn't seem pleased with that. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is that, notice this. When the 10 heard about James and John, they were indignant. Now, Jesus has just said, we're going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to be crucified. They're not indignant about that. They're indignant. They're upset about James and John trying to get shotgun. This is really, as I think about it, James and John saying, I call shotgun. Jesus calls them together and says, you don't get it. That's the way things work in the world, but that's not the way things work in the kingdom. And that is the third problem with ladders, is that Jesus doesn't call us to climb. Please hear that. Jesus doesn't call us to climb. Jesus calls us to be faithful, to serve him, to stand with him, to be willing to serve others. And then he says, I will lift you up. Jesus does not call us to climb. That's the real problem. If you haven't heard, there was an election this week. You probably haven't heard that. It wasn't really big news at all. The real problem with the election is that in the kingdom of God, power and ladder climbing isn't the right goal. On both sides, I'm not making a political statement here, but on both sides, I heard people claiming in the name of Jesus that if we just have the power, we can do the right thing. That if we can just get our people in control, everything will be fixed. And the only problem with that is that Jesus never understood it that way. Power isn't the right ladder. Comfort isn't the right ladder. Status isn't the right ladder. I remember sitting in China with pastors who were functioning in illegal churches, risking their lives. At least half of them had been imprisoned. And by the way, Chinese prisons, not real nice. They'd been imprisoned for their faith, and they said, do not pray that persecution would end. Pray that in persecution we would be strong. Don't pray for persecution to end. Pray that we would be strong. Persecution, as you would talk to them more, they said persecution will build our faith. Persecution will show the world that we have a suffering servant Messiah. Jesus didn't come to grab power. Jesus came to give power away. And if you've grown up in the church, I wrestled with this week a lot. If you've grown up in the church, you know that. But I think it's one of those things that is so unnatural to us that we miss it. Jesus says, don't demand your rights. Give it away. Jesus deserved to sit on the throne in heaven, and he gave it up. And he says this in verse 28, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. He's saying, I didn't go up the ladder, I climbed down. So at this point, the disciples are confused. James and John are probably embarrassed. Their mom, we don't know what she was thinking, but we don't hear about her again for a while. And then it says there were two blind men sitting by the roadside. And this connects here. And they heard that Jesus was going by. They shouted, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Imagine the world as these two blind men would experience the world. Maybe they were homeless and that's where they slept. Maybe they had a family home, but their days would have been spent in darkness, just calling out, help! And generally they would have been asking for money. They wouldn't really know what was happening. They would call out for money. Most people would ignore them. Let's be honest. If you were walking in downtown Chicago and you saw a beggar, a homeless person, a street person, and it was obvious that they were blind, wouldn't you be tempted to just kind of walk by silently? Honestly? And they heard apparently that Jesus was coming. We don't know what they had heard, but they called out to this Jesus. They said, Son of David. Now, maybe they were thinking, I mean, this is the kind of the coming king that, I mean, David was the wealthiest king that Israel had ever had, except for his son, who was even wealthier. But still, if he was son of David, maybe he's going to have money for us. And they call out for mercy. And the fourth problem here, and follow me on this, the fourth problem with ladders is that even if we know where the ladders go, we make bad choices. Here's Jesus. And they call out for mercy. Most scholars think they were probably asking for money. They don't say, Jesus, Son of David, Lord, Son of David, heal us. They just call out for mercy. And the crowd says, be quiet, be quiet. But they shout louder. Now, don't miss the beautiful thing here is that they were calling out for Jesus. They would not take no for an answer. How often do we call out to God once? We say, I prayed about it. They don't take no for an answer. They want Jesus badly. And I do want to ask you, how badly do you want Jesus? Most days of my life, I don't want Jesus badly enough. Anybody else relate to that? Jesus stopped and calls to these two guys, "What do you want me to do for you?" Now, notice the similarity to the conversation that Jesus had with Mrs. Zebedee. She came up and said, "Will you do me a favor?" And Jesus says, "What do you want?" Here again, Jesus says, "What is it that you want?" James and John and their mom wanted status. But in this case, Jesus looked into the hearts of the two blind men and saw what their hearts really longed for. He said, "What do you want?" And I wonder if there was a moment of pause when they said, "Well, what do we really want?" We want to see. We want our sight. Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. Ultimately, the deepest desire of our hearts, even if we don't know it, is to be with Jesus. Let me say that again. Even if we don't realize it, the deepest cry of our hearts is to walk with Jesus. Both of these stories, to wrap this up, are about us wanting things. Wanting to climb the ladder, wanting to accomplish something, wanting. There's a story I heard soon after I became a believer. I don't know if I've told this before, but in the next few years, I'll continue to tell at least once every year or two, because it's just... There was a little girl, about 4 years old, and every day her father would come home from work, and she would be looking out the window for her father, just watching. And she would see these cars driving by, and then finally she'd see her daddy's car, and as he pulled into the driveway, she would come running out, and she would, he almost had to like dodge her with the car because she was running out there because she wanted to see her daddy. And every day she would jump into her daddy's arms almost before he had a chance to get out of the car. And she would say, "Daddy, I love you." And he would say, "I love you too." As he held his little girl, and all the stuff of the day was washed away. Every day he would do that. And she would do that. But then one day, it changed a little bit, because she came running out and she jumped into her daddy's arms and said, "Daddy, Daddy, I love you." And he said, "I love you too." And he reached into his coat and he pulled out a gift. And she tore it open because she was excited. I mean, it's a gift from your daddy. And it was a little chain of pop beads. I don't know if you remember pop beads. In my mind, they were something that always we had in the church, in like the preschool room, the little plastic bead things that kind of pop together. And a cheap little gift, but she loved it because it had different colors And most importantly, it was from her daddy. And so things changed then a little bit, because he would come home and she would come running out and say, "Daddy, Daddy, I love you, and I love my pop beads." And she'd have them around her neck as a necklace. And every day she would just be bursting with joy. "Daddy, I love you, and I love my pop beads." And he got to thinking. And one day she came running out and she said, "Daddy, I love you. I love my pop beads." And he looked at her and he said, "I love you too. But if you love me, will you give me your pop beads?" And he said, and she's like, "But Daddy, I love my pop beads." And he says, "If you love me, you'll give me your pop beads." And she kind of wriggled out of his arms and she ran into the house crying. The next day he came home from work and she didn't come out the door. The next day, again, she didn't come out the door. The third day, he pulled into the driveway, and the door opened on the house, and this little girl, tear-stained face walked out and didn't run, didn't jump into his arms. She just walked out. And she said, "Daddy, I love you." And she took off her pop beads and she handed them to her daddy. And she was just crying, and Dad was crying. And he reached into his coat again and he pulled out a box, and inside was a string of pearls. We have things we want. And God says, "I have something better for you." We hold on to little junky, cheap stuff of this world, and our God says, "If you will give that to me, I have something better for you." And we hold so tightly to our dreams. And the Father says, "If you love me, you'll give me that goal, that dream, that possession, that thing you lean on." And the Father of Jesus says, when you give that up and place it in my arms, I will always, ultimately, bless you with something better. Because that's what a loving Father does. Let's pray. Lord,